Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the first webinar of 2018 of the series of webinars organized by the regional platform on low emission resilient development strategies for Latin America and the Caribbean, Let's LAC. My name is Ana Maria Majano. I'm the coordinator of the Secretariat for Let's LAC. I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this webinar. And of course, to thank our partners for today's webinar, the Inter-American Development Bank and the Joint Global Change Research Institute. Thank you very much for helping us organize and deliver this webinar. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to mention that we are going to have 3 presentations, one after the other, and that are going to last about 45 minutes. And then we will have another 45 minutes for questions and answers. So if you have questions or comments on any of the presentations, please write them using the space provided for questions on your control panel, and I will read them to the presenters. You can, if you want, you can write the questions in Spanish also, and I will try to translate them. Now we go to our presenters on this very interesting and important topic of the implications of the Paris Agreement for stranded assets in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our presenters today, Alejandra, can you move to the next slide, please? Alejandra? Well, sorry. Our presenters for today are Adrian Votz-Schlieb, who is a climate change economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. He is going to tell us about the work they are doing assessing politically feasible decarbonization pathways. And then we are going to have the presentation by James Edmonds, who is Chief Scientist and Battelle Fellow at the Joint Global Change Research Institute, which is a collaboration of the University of Maryland and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory on the implications of the Paris Agreement for stranded assets. And then we will have the presentation by Gokul Iyer, who is engineer at the Joint Global Change Research Institute on the implications of the Paris Agreement for stranded assets in the power sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. These are the a preliminary analysis. So thank you very much for to our presenters for sharing your knowledge and the result of your work with us. We are going to start with Adrian. Adrian, please go ahead with your presentation.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you a lot, Ana Maria. Just before I start, I'd like to double check whether you can hear me and whether you can see my slide right now.
Yes, we can hear you and see your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Adrian Vogtschild. I work as a climate change economist at the IDBA. I'd like to start by thanking really very much the Let's LAC platform and the audience for their interest, and also the Joint Research Institute, from where Gokul Iyer and Jay Edmonds are, who did most of the work that we actually going to present today. I'm just going to make a very broad introduction, talking to you about how this project that the Joint Research Institute is implementing fits into the broader framework for climate change knowledge that I am trying to manage at the Inter-American Development Bank. So let me start with this. I think everybody in the audience knows that the objective of the Paris Agreement is to limit the temperature increase below 2 degrees and as close as possible as 1.5 degrees Celsius increase above pre-industrial levels. So the question I have for you is, how much do you think that we need to reduce carbon emissions to implement the objectives of the Paris Agreement? I'd like everybody to think about it for a minute. Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 20%? The answer I always give in my presentations is 100%. So the point here is that it is a very big and ambitious change that we need to implement. Let me explain quickly why. So climate science is very complex, but it turns out, after analysis of thousands of scenarios from a lot of different climate models, that there is a quite simple relationship as the first order approximation between the total amount of CO2, of carbon emissions, that humankind is going to emit, that you can see here in the x-axis, and the resulting temperature increase that would happen on Earth that you could see in the y-axis. So this graph is an adaptation from the last assessment report of the International Panel on Climate Change about climate science. And you can see again that there's an almost linear relationship. You see a band because there's a lot of uncertainty, but the big picture is that it's linear. Which means that if you have an objective, such as a 2-degree target here, there is an amount of CO2 that's the maximum amount of CO2 that humankind can emit to stay below that target. Again, it's uncertain, so instead of a number, what we have is a range, in this case, between 2.5 and 4.5 thousand gigatons of CO2. But what we know is that there's a finite number. If you have a more ambitious target, like the 1.5 degrees, then you would simply get a smaller carbon budget, less emissions that you can emit. So the key implication of the carbon budget is that we need to reach zero net emissions in the long term. This is still from the last IPCC assessment report. And you can see first in green all the baseline emissions. So this is over time on the x-axis, how much emissions would happen in the y-axis. In the baseline, this is if we don't do anything to try to limit climate change. Then in blue, you see all the emission scenarios that reach 3 degrees Celsius. And in red, you see all the scenarios that reach 2 degrees Celsius. And what you see is that the 3 degrees Celsius targets reach zero net emissions by the end of the century. And the 2 degrees target, the scenarios, the pathways that reach 2 degrees reach zero emissions before the end of the century. At the time when the IPCC report was published, the 1.5 degree target was not discussed that seriously in the scientific community. But if it had been assessed, I can tell you that the result would be that for 1.5 degrees, we need to reach zero net emissions even before. So maybe by mid-century, by 2050. In general, when I present this, people tell me this is not possible. It's not possible that we're going to reach zero emissions of CO2 in the long term. Well, the good news is that the same IPCC report has reviewed thousands of academic studies that have looked at how we could do that, how we could reach zero net emissions. In addition to those academic studies, there's a lot of studies by think tanks and the international agencies like the International Energy Agency. So there's a lot of studies that look at this issue, and they all agree on basically 4 things that we need to do at the global level to reach zero net emissions. I call them the 4 pillars of decarbonization. The first one is to reach zero carbon electricity. So a key example for that would be to have renewable power, but you could also use nuclear power or other zero carbon electricity technologies to produce electricity without emitting carbon emissions. Once you know that you're going to need clean electricity, it makes a lot of sense to use that electricity as much as you can in the rest of the economy. We call that electrification. The maybe simplest example is electric vehicles, electric cars. But you can also think about electric trains in countries where trains are not electric yet. You can think about electric heating, electric cooking, use of electricity for industry, things like that. The third pillar is efficiency. So energy efficiency in the picture using energy efficiency technologies for lighting, but also reducing waste in the food sector. And maybe most importantly, efficiency at the level of cities, which would mean a lot of public transport and a lot of well-insulated buildings, for instance. And the fourth pillar, which is particularly important for Latin America, is what is called natural carbon sinks in the scientific literature, which basically means stopping the deforestation and instead growing more forests. Because I don't know if everybody knows that, but when trees grow from the soil, they absorb carbon as they breathe from the atmosphere, and then all the carbon in the trees comes from the atmosphere. So we know that in the long term, we need to reach zero net emissions. We have a good idea of what kind of things we need to see happening in the long term. And from the Inter-American Development Bank, what I try to help countries doing is navigate two questions that I think are key. One is, okay, this is a long-term plan, but what should countries do in the short term? What should they do by 2020? What should they do by 2025? And the second is, how can they do that in a way that is politically and socially acceptable? So let me start with the first one that I'm calling here aligning short-term NDCs with the need for long-term decarbonization. So long-term decarbonization is what I just talked about. NDCs here stands for the nationally determined contributions, which is the climate policy plans that countries have submitted in the Paris Agreement. So they are basically strategies to reduce emissions by 2025. So I have a metaphor to explain the problem of the aligning 2025 climate policies with the need for long-term decarbonization by the end of the century. So countries, again, are going to think about their climate policies for the short term. They're going to say by 2025, which is the short term for the climate times, but is already the long term for the political times. They're going to say by 2025, I want to reduce emissions a little. For instance, I want to reduce emissions by 20%. My metaphor here is that reducing emissions 20% is a modest effort. It's like building a house. Now, what I told you before is that by 2050 or by 2100, we need to reduce emissions a lot, say by 90%. So this is very ambitious. This is like building a tower. And what I'm trying to say to people working in climate policy is that when you want to build a tower, like in the right, you do not start by building a house. Instead, you start by digging foundations for the tower. So that's my metaphor to say that the objective for the climate strategy up to 2025, so the short-term one, is not going to be only to reduce emissions a little bit, but is better understood as a foundation for a deep decarbonization in the long term. I have a more concrete example for the energy sector from Mexico's climate change mid-century strategy. So that is a document that the government of Mexico submitted to the climate negotiations, basically. And what you can see in this specific example about electricity production in Mexico is that they designed a strategy that starts from today, so between 2015 and 2020, and looks at today, all the electricity comes from coal, gas, and hydro, basically. They say in the long term, in 2050, we want a lot of the electricity in orange to come from renewable power. And because we understand that all this renewable power is not going to be possible to get if we start building windmills and photovoltaic panels, in 2049, we need to start now. So what you can see is a smooth progress from 0% renewable power, or virtually 0%, to about 75%. And my point here is that this pathway of renewable power expansion gives us an idea of what would be a good short-term target. So here you see in this example, about 10% of electricity in 2030, in this specific example in Mexico, comes from renewable power in 2030. And again, what's important here is that it's not the target per se in 2030, it's the understanding that it's a first step towards a lot more renewable power in the long term. And what you're going to see in the next presentation is the kind of tools that are available in academia to do this kind of strategies at the country level. And I gave you an example for renewable power in the electricity sector, but the point is that a similar exercise should happen for the 4 important things that we need for reaching zero net emissions, which again are renewable electricity, or in general, zero carbon electricity, electrification, efficiency, and carbon cleans. Someone is not on mute, and I can hear some echo. So just in this slide, I was giving you 4 examples of short-term targets that would be consistent with reaching zero emissions using the 4 pillars. So for instance, a target for renewable power, like in the previous example, or a target about how many buses in Bogota, for instance, we would like to have working only on electricity, or a target of how many new buildings in Mexico City we want to be very energy efficient, or a target instead of reaching stopping deforestation, for instance, by 2025 in one country. Then my second big question that I'm trying to help countries with is how we can, when we design those targets, take into account political economy constraints. And again, what I'm giving you here is just a basic framework, and you will see that the work that we're doing with the Joint Research Center implements that in a particular case. So let me just take a minute to explain what I mean with the political economy by taking an example that has absolutely nothing to do with climate change, which is the abolition of slavery in the 19th century by the British Empire. So did you know that when the British abolished slavery, they used up to 40% of the budget of the government of the British Empire to do a big cash transfer, a big payoff to the owners of plantations in the colonies. And they didn't do that because they thought that the slave owners were the good guys in the story. They did that because they realized that when you want to do a big ambitious reform like abolishing slavery, which is going to be good overall for the country and for humankind, it's still going to create groups of winners and groups of losers. And in some cases, the groups of losers can have the political power to make your reform impossible. So in that case, the British Empire had the impression that since the slave owners were basically the rich people and the politically powerful people of that times, and basically the government was constituted by a lot of these people, they realized it wasn't possible to do without compensating the slave owners. So that's just an example from a book that I really like. That's the picture I put about the political economy of policy transitions. that highlights the need to understand who's going to lose and who's going to win in your policies, and think about whether you need to compensate or avoid losers. And in the case of climate policy, a big issue like that is the issue that we call stranded assets. So let me give you a quick example. If you live in a country and you live, for instance, here in Mexico, far away from the business center, and you need to commute every day, and the car that you use to commute is an energy inefficient car, so you need to burn gasoline every day to go to your work, you are probably not going to be the best supporter of increasing the price of gasoline in your country, or for instance, putting a tax on carbon, or this kind of climate policies. Similarly, if you own a coal power plant, or if you are one of the thousands of people who work in a coal power plant, you are, as a voter, you're not going to be supportive, presumably, of extremely ambitious climate policies that would result in the shutdown of your coal power plant tomorrow, which would mean you losing your job or you losing the assets you own. So in general, we see two kinds of solutions to these problems. The first one is trying to identify who would lose from the transformation and try to convert these losers into winners. So I have here three examples. One could be retraining workers. So I like this story in the US, where in West Virginia, a state of the US that relies a lot of coal, an NGO realized that the skills you need to be a coal miner in West Virginia are actually very similar to the skill you need to be a photovoltaic panel, to be the person who installs the photovoltaic panels. Because when you work in a mine, you are basically using heavy machinery that uses a lot of electrical power, things like that. So you basically are an electrician. And when you need to install photovoltaic panels in roofs, you also need to understand high power electricity. Of course, these are not the only skills. So what this NGO is doing is retraining coal miners to so that they become workers in the renewable power industry. So that's just an anecdotal evidence to illustrate the idea that you can identify the workers who would be losing and trying to retrain them. The second bullet point here is about trying to compensate the region as a whole. So, maybe there is one particular state or one particular region in the country that, to keep the same example, relies a lot on coal power plants, which means that a lot of the economic activity in that region would be affected if you close down the coal power plants. Then maybe something that policymakers can do is to implement there the new projects. So for instance, the new windmills, the new photovoltaic panels, even if that region might not be the perfect one in terms of how much sun and wind it gets, the idea here would be to compensate for the loss of economic activity in that region. Or more generally, you can try to transform entirely an industry to switch it from the position of a loser to the position of a winner. A good example is the car manufacturers. So people who build cars, they can be avert to climate policies, but if you add them transform to electric vehicles, maybe they're going to become supporters of climate policies. And then the other thing you can do that's very different is to try to avoid stranded assets in the first place altogether. So think about strategies that would reduce emissions without closing down the coal power plants abruptly or things like that. So what I presented you here is just a big framework that says there's two big questions. One is, how do we make sure that what happens in the short term is consistent with the long term? And the second one is, how can we think about who would be losers and winners of those transformations? What you're going to see next is presentations by the Joint Research Institute that try to look specifically at those two questions in a few countries in Latin America in the case of stranded assets in the power sector. So thank you very much for your attention, and I am looking forward to see the presentations by Jay and Gokul.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for your presentation and the introduction. Before we go to James' presentation, I would like to remind everyone, please write your questions or comments on the space provided for questions on your control panel. And also, I would like to mention that this webinar is being recorded and that the recording of the webinar together with the PowerPoint presentations are going to be available on the web page of the Let's Slack platform afterwards. So now I would like to give the microphone to James Edmonds. Thank you very much for sharing the results of the work you're doing. James, please go ahead with your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Ana Maria. Let me just begin by thanking LEDS for the opportunity to present here today on the work that Gokul has been leading at the Joint Global Change Research Institute on stranded assets in Latin America and the Caribbean region, and also to the Inter-American Development Bank for its support of this work as well. So this presentation begins where I think Adrian left off. Just to remind you of the things that we all know, the foundation of the Paris Agreement to address climate change is the nationally determined contribution, which is a set of near-term goals. It's not necessarily a set of particular measures, and those have to be designed by the countries themselves. And that the long-term goal is to keep the average surface temperature of the planet well below 2 degrees, and that carries important implications. We'll delve a little bit deeper into the implications that Adrian began to show us. First, I want to remind us that Adrian pointed out that carbon emissions must ultimately decline to 0 or below, and that must occur in this century to achieve this goal of remaining well below 2 degrees. In the figure that you see at the moment, there are 6 panels, each of which shows the range that was recorded in the literature at the time of the publication of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 5th Assessment Report. And the literature is shown in terms of a range over all of the literature and then over the 25th to 75th percentile. So the middle half of the range is in the dark color, with the median being the bar that is at the middle of the range. So we going from left to right, we have net land use change emissions for the years 2030, 2050, and 2100. The emissions, direct emissions from the power sector for those same years, direct emissions from the transportation sector, direct emissions from buildings, industry, and non-CO2 greenhouse gases, which turn out to be extremely important when 2 degrees or below is the goal. What you see is the range that is in a light color being reference scenarios, and those tend to rise as Adrian showed. The reference scenarios have higher emissions in power generation as the economies expand. This is because if there were no such thing as climate change, there would be no reason to shift the mix of energy, which is at present predominantly delivered by fossil fuels. And so more would be used in all of the sectors of the economy, and more non-CO2 greenhouse gases would be emitted to the atmosphere. In the more prominent colors, you'll see that reducing the emissions to levels that are consistent with achieving the long-term goal of 2 degrees requires that emissions decline. You see this in every sector of the economy, land use included, and that land use change emissions shift from being positive to negative. That is, there is on balance by mid-century and beyond net accumulation of carbon in the terrestrial system. In the power sector, this is even more spectacular. Emissions not only decline in the period of 2030 on to 2050 and 2100, but go deeply negative. And this is facilitated by the assumption that is embedded in all of the scenarios reported here, that CO2 capture and storage is available and deployed in combination with bioenergy, so that the combination of bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage allows the terrestrial system to actually act as a carbon removal mechanism from the atmosphere. I won't go into the details of how that works in detail, but that's the mechanism that allows negative emissions. You can see that also there is in the background a shift toward electricity that occurs, and all of the sectors use more electricity, particularly buildings and industry. You note that buildings is already highly electrified, and therefore its negative emissions are achieved by going even further into electrification of that sector. Electrification of the industrial sector also occurs, as well as utilization of bioenergy. And then in the transportation sector, both electrification and the use of bioenergy, which is a renewable energy form net, is employed to reduce emissions in that sector. Finally, non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions are reduced, but they remain positive, and they are very difficult to remove, to drive to zero, because you have emission sources that are, for example, the production of crops and the application of fertilizer to those crops, which results in nitrous oxide emissions, but also rice cultivation, which releases CO2 to the atmosphere, and the use of cattle as a source of protein. There's also a figure that assumes that there is no CO2 capture and storage, in which case the role of electrification as a negative energy source to offset the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions is played by land use. And so land use change emissions go more deeply negative to offset the non-CO2 greenhouse gases. These changes have powerful implications for investment in capital equipment. You'll see in the left-hand panel total electricity generation investments, the change that occurs as a consequence of pursuing deep decarbonization goals. There is an increase in investment requirements to achieve these deep decarbonization goals for two reasons. One, the electrification means that there is, in many scenarios, an increase in the production of electricity, which requires more capacity to be brought online. And secondly, the deployment of non-emitting sources like renewables and nuclear and power plants with CO2 capture and storage is extremely capital intensive. You see also the substantial reduction relative to a business as usual scenario for investments in power plants without CO2 capture and storage, and in the extraction industries for fossil fuels. And finally, you see, as Adrian pointed out, substantial investments in energy efficiency. These changes can produce, as Adrian was telling us, something called stranded assets. That is, you can have either capital equipment that is retired before its lifetime is complete, its useful lifetime would normally be complete, and also fossil fuel resources whose owners find that there is no longer a market for those products, and therefore the value of those assets declines dramatically. We're going to focus in this presentation on the premature retirement of capital-intensive production. This is an important topic, and the reason that it's an important topic is that if assets are stranded, and those stranded assets are a significant fraction of economic activity, they can destabilize financial markets, and we all know the consequence of destabilizing financial markets, which the most prominent and recent example is the Great Recession, but it also introduces political risks for the stability of emissions mitigation programs, because, as Adrian was pointing out, there are winners and losers, and the losers, it's worth the value of their the company to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so you can encounter very stringent resistance if the stranded assets present a significant problem to individual stakeholders. So Latin America has potential for stranded assets. This is the energy system in Latin America today. The red is oil, the blue is natural gas, and the purple is coal. And you can see that more than 3/4 of all of the energy used in Latin America is in the form of fossil fuels. Looking at Latin America, going from Latin America in general to the individual economies in particular, we see a substantial range of energy systems, from Brazil, which has the largest share of renewable and non-emitting technology in Latin America, to Argentina, which is almost completely oil and gas dominated, to a place like Colombia, where you have a more balanced portfolio of oil, gas, and coal, but still dominated by oil, gas, and coal. Moving forward in a reference scenario that doesn't limit emissions of greenhouse gases, you see that the share of renewable of fossil fuels would be expected to continue to grow in their use, growing from about 40 to almost 60 overall in Latin America. So how does that play out in terms of the stranded assets that would be created in the power sector, is the topic that Gokul is going to share with you. And let me turn the floor over to Gokul Iyer to complete the presentation. Gokul?
Thanks, Adrian and Jay, and thank you to Anna Maria for facilitating this, and we're thankful to the Let's Lab platform for giving us an opportunity to present this work. So as Jay mentioned, I will be talking about preliminary analysis that we've been conducting at the Joint Global Change Research Institute, along with Adrian's support, on the implications of Paris Agreement for stranded assets in the Latin American Caribbean power sector. So the rest of the presentation will mostly be focused on the power sector and the big insights that we can gain out of some analyses. Now, let me give you a quick overview of the tool that we are using for our analysis. Now, this tool is called the Global Change Assessment Model, or GCAM. GCAM is a highly detailed human Earth system model sometimes also called as integrated assessment model. Now, GCAM links various representations of different sectors across the globe, including economy, energy, agriculture and land use, and climate systems, all under one consistent integrated framework. So all these representations, these are all numerous equations that are written to represent interactions across the various sectors, and they're all represented in one consistent framework. Now, one thing to note is to look at the maps on the left. So we have representations for 32 geopolitical regions or energy economy regions across the globe, of which we have representations for a number of countries within the Latin America, as you already saw in the previous slides that Jay presented. So we have a fair amount of regional detail in this model that makes it very useful for an analysis that is focused on the Latin American Caribbean. Also to be noted is that we have a lot of sectoral and technology level detail. For example, the energy sector representation in the model includes the representation of resource extraction, how it is transformed into useful form of energy, for example, electricity production from various sources or refining and so forth. And then finally, these useful forms of energy are consumed in end-use sectors, including buildings, transportation, and industry. So again, sectorally and technologically, this model is fairly detailed. Now, GCAM also tracks 24 greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants. Everything is tracked endogenously within the model based on various levels of activity within the different sectors. And I do want to highlight here that it does have representations for land use and land cover change emissions as well, and that's represented in over 280 land regions that are represented within the model. Now, the final point I want to make in this slide, and before going further, is that GCAM is among half a dozen other models that produce scenarios and are used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. And so a number of the figures that you saw previously that Jay and Adrian presented, GCAM is probably one of those lines and accounts for some of that uncertainty distributions in those figures. And we've been a part of the IPCC analysis for over 3 decades now. So we've been a part of all of the IPCC reports that have come online. So now, with that background about the tool of the analysis, let's now move on to see the nationally determined contributions that the Latin America and Caribbean countries came up with as part of the submission process to the Paris Agreement. So as you can see here, we've represented different NDCs within the Latin American and Caribbean region. For instance, Mexico, suggested a 22% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below business as usual emissions for 2030, and in contrast, Brazil was slightly more stringent. For example, they suggested a 37% reduction below 2005 in 2025, and then 43% reductions in 2030. So now we went ahead, collected all this information from the submissions to the Paris Agreement, and modeled all of these reductions into GCAM. And GCAM is a powerful tool because we have representations of all of these greenhouse gas emissions, endogenously, and so we could go ahead and model these emissions constraints and then study the implications of these constraints for the evolution of various sectors. Now, this slide here shows the two figures. The figure on the right is basically just what you just saw in the previous slide. The various emissions constraints that were modeled into GCAM as part of this exercise, and the figure on the right shows the fossil fuel and industrial CO2 emissions for the various countries within the Latin American and Caribbean region. So basically, that chart there shows the contribution of the different countries, nationally determined contributions to overall reductions within Latin American and Caribbean. So what we can see is that the contribution varies by country, and the most of the emissions reductions are being achieved in Mexico, which is the blue area over there in that chart, and the orange chart that represents Brazil. So Mexico and Brazil have the most contribute the most toward total reductions in the Latin American and Caribbean fossil fuel industrial CO2 emissions. Now, again, I just want to caveat this figure by saying that this represents only the energy system CO2 emissions. Just because the focus of this of the analysis is on the power sector and energy system in general. However, we do track land use change emissions, and all of those are counted in the analysis. We're just not presenting it here for the sake of simplicity. Okay, now once we modeled all of these NDCs, we went ahead and explored 4 emissions scenarios that vary across 2 dimensions. The first dimension is the amount of emissions reductions that are being achieved in the near term through 2030. And the second dimension is the amount of emissions reductions over the long term throughout this century. So on the long term side, we considered 2 cumulative emissions budgets. And as Adrian presented in his presentation earlier, a cumulative emissions budget is associated with a certain probability of achieving a particular temperature target. So in this case, we considered 2 cumulative emissions budgets, one that is consistent with a 50% chance of achieving 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and another that is consistent with a 50% chance of limiting global mean average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the emissions budget that corresponds to the 1.5 degree target is obviously more stringent compared to the one for the 2 degree Celsius target. So let me walk you through quickly the 4 emissions scenarios. Now, the first scenario corresponds to NDCs to 2 degrees Celsius. Now that scenario can be mapped to the orange line on the figure on the right. So basically, the assumption there is that countries achieve their emission goals through 2030, corresponding to the nationally determined contributions, and then beyond 2030, there is this cumulative emissions budget that is consistent with a 2 degree C goal. Now, the second scenario is the NDCs to 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, in which countries are assumed to achieve their near-term targets through 2030, corresponding to the NDCs, and then beyond 2030, there is a much more stringent cumulative emissions budget that corresponds to a 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the remaining 2 scenarios correspond to variants of the first 2 scenarios, wherein we assume that countries start acting on the cumulative emissions targets starting 2021. So basically, the assumption there is that countries ramp up their mitigation action in the near term, and you can see that from the chart on the right. For example, if we were to compare the NDCs to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the orange line, with the red line, which is a straight to 2 degrees Celsius, it's much more, the straight to version is slightly more stringent in the near term compared to the NDCs to 2 degrees C scenario. And likewise, the NDCs to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the green line, is relatively less stringent in the near term compared to the straight to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the blue line on the chart to the right. So all this just gives an indication of what we are going to see in the next couple of slides, where I will start showing the implications of all these emissions reductions for the Latin America and Caribbean power sector. Okay, now this chart here shows the capacity additions and premature retirements in the Latin America power sector in gigawatts. So just to give a quick sense of this complicated chart here. I understand it's pretty complicated. So let's take a moment to understand this. So the bars to the positive axis, so that is greater than 0, correspond to new installations or capacity additions that need to occur in these scenarios in the power sector in Latin America and Caribbean region. Again, the units is in gigawatts. Now, the bars on the negative side of the y-axis correspond to prematurely retired capital, or these are capital that in the power sector that need to be retired before the end of the useful lifetime of that capital. So these correspond to mostly fossil fuel power plants that just need to be retired in order to meet these stringent emissions targets. So now one thing that's very interesting to note here is that most of the new capital that comes online, or new power plants that need to be installed in these scenarios, correspond to low carbon technologies, including renewables, nuclear, and carbon CO2 capture and storage. The CCS technologies, or CCS stands for CO2 capture and storage technologies, that correspond to the hashed bars in that figure, and we can see substantial deployment of those technologies as well in these scenarios. And that is because in the scenarios that were run for this exercise, we did not put any limitations on technology availability. And this is just a preliminary analysis, and going forward we will look at implications for meeting these targets under scenarios where such technologies are not available. Now, on the negative axis, we see, as I mentioned earlier, premature retirement of power plants, and most of that prematurely retired capital comes from fossil fuel-based capacity, including coal and natural gas and oil. Now, the scenarios that we just saw correspond to just the 2 degree C scenarios. Now, if we were to look at the 1.5 degree C scenarios, the situation is much more stark, in particular in the NDCs to 1.5 degree C scenario, where we see that in order to achieve these stringent targets, substantial amount of capital needs to come online, and that number corresponds to like 300 gigawatts of new capacity coming online in a relatively short time period of just 5 years. Now, this 300 gigawatts of capacity, just to place that in context, the current cumulative installed capacity in Latin American Caribbean is 366 gigawatts of capacity, and we are talking about almost comparable amount of new capital and power plant capacity coming online in a relatively very tight time period of like 5 years. And in that same time period, we are also talking about roughly 75 gigawatts of fossil fuel-based capacity comprising of oil, gas, and coal-fired power plants being prematurely retired before the end of the lifetime, which has important implications for stranded assets. Now, just to show a quick point over here, it's interesting to note that the straight to 2 degrees C's NDCs to 2 degrees C's and the NDCs to 1.5 degrees C's, in the near term, they have very comparable levels of capacity additions, and that's just consistent with the emission scenarios we saw earlier, where their emission levels are also pretty much similar. So that's a small aside and interesting point that I wanted to make here on the slide here. Now, moving forward, we see here that in order to achieve these transitions, there are a large amount of capital investments required in the power sector in order to achieve these targets and meet these capacity addition requirements. So here the charts show investment costs in billion 2010 US dollars. And again, the scenario that stands out here is the NDCs to 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, where we see massive amounts of capital investments corresponding to about $800 billion in just a single 5-year time window in order to meet the stringent target of 1.5 degrees Celsius following the NDCs in the near term. Now, what's useful also from this figure to note is that although the straight to 1.5, although the NDCs to 1.5 degrees Celsius corresponds to relatively lower costs in the near term, and that's because that's by construction, and corresponding to the emissions that we saw, they achieve higher emission levels corresponding to the straight to scenarios. In the long term, the NDCs to 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario corresponds to substantially higher costs. And that is, again, because there is a substantial reduction of emissions required in the long term in order to meet the stringent budget. So this figure here also shows that strengthening NDCs in the near term could result in substantial savings in the long term. Now, similar messages emerge out of this slide here, where we are showing the value, the economic value of the prematurely retired capital or stranded assets. Again, the NDCs to 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, we see substantial amounts of stranded asset value, and also we see that there is substantial savings to be had in the long term, in particular when we're talking about the 1.5 degrees Celsius. In summary, the successful implementation of the Paris Agreement is expected to have important implications for the stranding of fossil fuel assets. Stranded assets is a very important issue for the Latin American Caribbean region, just because of the existence and prominence of fossil fuel-based energy supply in the current energy mix. Now, achieving the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement will entail substantial stranding of existing fossil fuel-based infrastructure, and that could have important implications for the economy and the financial system in general. However, our analysis, our preliminary analysis, does show that strengthening the NDCs in the near term could have important implications, in particular in reducing the economic costs and the stranded assets in the Latin American Caribbean. So with that, we would like to open the floor for discussion and any questions you would have.
Thank you very much, Adrian, James, and Gokul for your excellent presentations. I just would like to know to everyone that the presentations and the recording of the webinar is going to be available at the Let's Slack webpage after this webinar. So, and also please write your questions for the panelists. We have a question for Adrian regarding, you talked about winners and losers, and Rodrigo Garcia would like to know if you think that the power companies will, in the case of, for example, carbon taxes, if they will pass through all the carbon tax to other economic sectors, or just a fraction of the carbon tax. And I have also some questions for the panelists. Adrian, I would like to know how this type of analysis, and I think this collaboration is great, but how this type of analysis is being used in the dialogue of the bank with the governments when supporting their development of the policies of the climate and development policies. And also to James and Gokul, you mentioned this is a preliminary analysis for the power sector. Are you working on, let's say, deeper analysis in the power sector, and are you planning to do this type of analysis for transport or any other sectors for Latin America and the Caribbean in the short term? So please, Adrian, and then James and Gokul, if you could comment on this.
Hi, this is Adrian. Thank you very much, Ana Maria and Rodrigo Garcia, for this questions. And also, I'd like to just take a minute to thanks again, Jay and Gokul. I think those were very great presentations. The first question was on whether the carbon tax would impact consumers depending on how the increase in price is passed through electricity prices. I think this is a good question, and that makes me want to talk about the broader context. We showing here a particular study, but indeed in my work program from the IDB, we look at potential losers from climate policies. And we have identified that there's basically three categories of potential losers. One is the owners of capital, for instance, the owners of coal power plants. Another one is the workers, for instance, workers who work in coal power plants. And indeed, the third one is consumers. And on consumers, actually, I have another project that I would very like to present in this seminar, maybe in about 6 months when we have more results, which is on identifying what would be the impact of increasing energy prices on consumers. And we are doing this in more than 10 countries of Latin America. And we are looking indeed at how, for instance, if you put a carbon tax, that would increase the price of gasoline and directly affect people who drive. But it would also impact the cost of gas and coal. That would impact the cost of electricity. And that would impact consumers because they buy electricity. But it will also impact consumers, for instance, because they go to the hairdresser, and the hairdresser uses electricity. So we call that the direct and indirect impact of energy price hikes. There's a standard method to analyze these kind of things. And it's important that instead of focusing on trying to predict what would be the impact, my work in this project is to come up, and that links to the third question of how we talk with government with that, is look at what options government have to manage those distributional impacts. For instance, a lot of countries in the last decade have been removing fossil fuel subsidies, which means increasing energy prices the same way it would happen if you put carbon taxes or gasoline taxes. And some countries have succeeded, and some countries have not succeeded in trying to do that. And what we do is we look at the international evidence and the history and try to draw lessons. And one thing that is emerging is that if you have a clear understanding of who is going to lose and why, for instance, the poor households in your economy can lose not because they drive because they don't, but because the cost of public transportation would increase, then you have specific options to compensate for those losses. For instance, you could decide to subsidize public transport, or you could decide to use a fraction of the money that the government wins when he puts taxes on gasoline or he removes subsidies to increase other parts of government spending that benefit poor people that would be losing because of the carbon tax. For instance, better education, better health, things like that, but also just more cash transfers. In all countries of Latin America, there are cash transfer programs like Mi Familia Progresa or Bolsa Familia in Brazil. Every single country has one. And one thing we're looking at is how we can use those existing social protection programs to shield poor and vulnerable households from energy prices increase. And then we let know governments about that to see if they want the help of the IDB in actually implementing something in that direction. But it's a very long process. First you do the study, then you talk with the governments, and maybe then they do it, or maybe they do it without us, etc. I just wanted to, for the second question, also say a couple of things, which is that another thing that governments can do, and that hasn't been presented today because the GCAM team hasn't done the analysis yet, but it is in our work program for this year. This was a 2 years project, and we're in the middle, is to look at options for the government to reach the same NDCs without producing stranded assets. What if we do less efforts in the power sector and we do more efforts in the forestry sector, for instance? Is it feasible then to reach the same emission reduction by either reducing, canceling completely, or just managing, trying to have only half of the stranded assets, things like that? And then you can think about what kind of policies would do that. We've been talking about carbon taxes, but carbon taxes is not the only policy. If instead of carbon taxes, you use renewable portfolio auctions, so you just support the growing up of renewable energy without directly penalizing the existing fossil fuel industry in your country, then you're going to be reducing emissions not as fast, and there's going to be trade-offs. but you could, let's say, have points in the political economy side. So that's the kind of trade-offs we're trying to quantify with this study.
Thank you, Adrian. James and Gokul, would you like to comment on some of these questions?
This is Jay, and I just like to add one point to Adrian's comments on the effect of the NDC implementation on the price of electricity. There is a limit to how much the price of carbon would be passed through, and that's partly determined by the demand side, but also it's partly determined by the fact that the power sector has options to execute, which allow them to continue to produce power at lower cost than just simply passing through the tax. And in fact, it is that tax which drives the shift away from the fossil fuels into less expensive renewable and other non-emitting technologies that is, one, the mechanism by which emissions are reduced, but also by which the change in the price of electricity is moderated. I'll turn it over to Gokul to talk about the directions for future work.
Right. So this is Gokul here, and so like Adrian mentioned earlier, this is a 2-year project, and we are slowly reaching the middle of the project now, and the focus so far has been on the power sector. However, we will be also looking into other sectors, potentially transport, and also potentially more deeper analysis in the power sector. For example, a lot of the results that we presented in the slides today show the availability of carbon capture and storage technologies, substantial deployment of those technologies, although we know that these technologies have not really seen the phase of commercialization yet. And so, there are a number of those kinds of issues that we want to try and test. What if there is CO2, there is no deployment of CO2 capture and storage? And like Adrian mentioned, another interesting question that we would like to assess, and that's potentially interesting, is what if there is no stranding of fossil fuel based capacity? Can we still meet these stringent goals in those kinds of situations? So these are a number of research directions that we have that we've planned for the coming year. But this is a very nice opportunity for us to get feedback from the broader community in terms of whether this is in the right direction, are we addressing the right issues, and so forth.
Thank you very much. Well, I have a question related to the carbon capture. Carbon storage and capture, and I will read it later. I have a number of questions, and I will read 3 or 4 questions at once. And please, if you can, or let's say 3, so that I don't. I'm going to read 3 questions, and please, you, all of you, comment on those issues that you would like to address. So the first one is, well, I have several comments on how good the presentations are, and Luis Ramos is telling us, I just hope that the government authorities from energy, economy, and planning agencies are listening, and of course that comes to that dialogue that Adrian was mentioning, that the bank and hopefully other international cooperation agencies and organizations are having about this with governments and other partners in the region about these issues. Susana del Granado is asking, in this context, what are the opportunities and risks for the financial private sector investing in energy infrastructure? And there is one question specifically for Adrian from Shell Kune, who says, does the IDB implement or plan to implement a climate test for energy sector projects to make sure they are compatible with A, the NDCs, and B, the temperature targets of the Paris Agreement? And Shell is also asking all the speakers to comment on what does the solar revolution currently underway mean for Brazilian pre-salt oil, on which high hopes rest in Brazil. Will this be stranded, or will they get it out in time to sell it? So if you could, starting again in the same order that you presented, comment on these questions, and we will have other blocks afterwards. Please go ahead, Adrian.
Okay, thank you very much for this very positive feedback. It's really a pleasure to be presenting this today. I'm going to focus on the question on the stress testing of IDB operation. This is certainly something that we get a lot as a question, and I have to emphasize that my work here is to do research from the climate department, but the IDB is much bigger than just me, and my department has very little political power. So I have a lot of freedom to do a lot of studies and have these kind of discussions, but it doesn't mean that anything that I'm presenting or that I'm saying is an official IDB policy. However, in general, this is something we're thinking about. How can we look and make sure that the investments of the countries and the investments of the IDB in particular are consistent with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And actually, we have a whole work program that we call Deep Decarbonization Pathways that goes into that direction. And the work we do here with the PNNL is, let's say, one very early pilots to show to stakeholders within the bank and within the countries what kind of analytical tools are available to look at these kind of questions. And by the way, I'd like to emphasize that I don't know how clear it is for everybody what luck we have to be working with this team. For instance, Jay Edmond was one of the, let's say, builders of the whole academic field looking at these things for the last decades. So we have really a lot of expertise available to be looking at that. I just wanted on that topic to mention a project that I'm also leading, which is actually called Deep Decarbonization Pathways LAC. And what we're doing is trying to empower academics in Latin America to look at those questions themselves, so then they can engage with the civil society and politicians in their country about these issues. The way we're doing that is by training teams in Latin America to use the kind of tools that you've been seeing today. And actually, Jay's team is also in that project, and I feel very lucky for that. But we also have models that come from Sweden, other parts of the United States, or Brazil that we are trying to disseminate among a few countries in Latin America, so that so that we, as from the IDB, are not the only ones looking at these studies and questions, but other people would be able to do it independently from us in the future.
Thank you, Adrian. Jay and Gokul, would you like to answer some of the questions?
I'll just start by saying I think Adrian has handled very expertly all of the questions about the IDB, and we won't attempt to go any further along down that path. I will just make one comment on the very first question, which was the opportunities that are created by the NDCs for private sector investment. And in one of the very early panels that we showed in our presentation, you see that there's a substantial change in the investment patterns that are consistent with achieving the NDC goals, and that creates very substantial investment opportunities. And in fact, because of the two features that drive the change in investment. One of them is the electrification process. So electricity becomes a more important opportunity for profitable investments. And secondly, the capital intensiveness of the non-emitting technology suite. There are substantial opportunities for investments that are consistent with the achievement of nationally determined contributions throughout Latin America. Gokul, you want to take on the other issues?
Sure. So I think one of the questions that Anna Maria raised was about the solar revolution, which I will assume talks about or represents the rapid reduction in solar technology costs that we've seen in the past. Now, what does all that mean for the stranded assets analyses or the issues of stranded assets that we are talking about here? Now, to the extent that we all need to, that the world needs to be constraining carbon emissions in order to achieve these stringent goals, yes, these kinds of reductions in technology costs will facilitate that. That will help in achieving these stringent goals over the long term. But it's also important to note that in order to get to 100% reduction in carbon emissions, we have to displace fossil fuel based capacity. And so stranded assets is sort of inevitable in the sense that the capital that exists and that is inefficient and that is creating these emissions will have to be shut down in some sense. But however, the economic costs that are associated with these shutting down and these stranded assets can be moderated by these so-called solar revolution or rapid reduction and technological change in emerging technologies, including solar, carbon capture and storage, and other low carbon technologies. So that's my 2 cents on that. I'm not sure if Jay and Adrian would have anything to add on that.
That's good.
Yes, thank you very much, Gokul. I think that Shell's question was, for a specific issue, what does it mean for the solar revolution for the for Brazilian pre-salt oil? And that is something that is that there are high hopes about in Brazil. And will this be stranded, or will they get it out? In case you want to just comment on that. And I have another question for you, Gokul, regarding the GCAM scenarios. Mia Moisio says that all the scenarios presented for capacity additions include a substantial amount of fossil technologies with CCS. However, contrary to renewable, there have to date not been major economically viable CCS projects. Have you modeled scenarios without CCS in case the technology does not become economically viable in the short term? If so, what would be the investment implications for other technologies? And we have another question from Vehab Chaturvedi. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing the name right. He is writing from CEEW, India. Thank you for the presentation. And he's asking, he would like to know if retrofitting options change the message from the stranded assets analysis, in the sense that could one argue that we will invest in coal now and then, rather than fossil capacity be stranded, we will retrofit CCS in fossil plants, so there will not really be a need for a huge capital investment, as well as one will avoid any stranded assets. So these are the questions for now, and please Gokul, there is one specifically for you and the others. I'm asking also Jay and Adrian to comment as they consider convenient. Gokul, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks for those questions. I mean, both of these questions are great and something that we've been sort of thinking about as part of this project and part of the broader portfolio of projects that we are involved in the context of decarbonization and mitigation in general. So now, carbon capture and storage, as rightly mentioned, is not commercially viable as of date, and so the way we constructed the scenarios was to allow their deployment, even if they are not commercially viable today, under the assumption that they will become available in the future. Now that said, these scenarios don't necessarily mean that's the right way of doing it, and as I mentioned earlier, that is potential sensitivity scenarios that we will be exploring in the future in terms of examining the implications for investments and stranded assets in a case where there is no CCS deployment. Now, to the extent that we will be limiting the deployment of a key technology in mitigation scenarios, we expect to see greater investments in substitute technologies, including renewables and potentially even nuclear. And these kinds of results have been observed in the literature in the past, including in the scenarios in the IPCC and other important reports. And of course, we will potentially see even greater stranded assets and economic costs for the society in those scenarios. So that's on the first question. Now the second question, which talks about retrofitting options. Now this is a relatively new concept in the modeling where people are talking about, hey, can we just invest in coal-fired power plants today and with CCS going forward? The economics of that is not very clear so far. It's pretty ambiguous, but the current state of knowledge is mostly consistent, and it says that retrofitting is a very expensive option, and so even if that's maybe sort of viable, the overall cost effectiveness of those kinds of scenarios will be probably limited. And one thing to note is that most of these scenarios with CCS, these substantial investments in bioenergy with CCS that have implications for negative emissions, that even if we increase emissions now, we can by deploying bioenergy in combination with CCS, that can result in negative emissions in order to meet these stringent climate. So those are just various. I know I sort of didn't answer the second question. Here's some.
Hello.
And Adrian might have some thoughts to add.
Yeah, just very briefly on that. In the work we've done, we have not assumed that it's possible to retrofit. That's development work that lies in our future. Nor have we explored the case in which we have disallowed the deployment of CO2 capture and storage. It's a very interesting technical sensitivity that we intend to do, as well as exploring scenarios in which nuclear is deployed. These are sensitivity analyses that I think will help shed light on both the cost of meeting NDCs and pathways to 2 degrees. So they are important directions for work in the future. Going back to the Brazilian oil, in this analysis, we have not attempted to look at the value of fossil fuel assets and those types of assets. So again, that's a set of stranded asset research that is potentially available to us in the future. The one thing I can say about the stranding of assets in fossil fuels is that in all of the emissions reduction scenarios, the value or the price of fossil fuels is no higher than it is in a reference scenario, and in general is lower. As a consequence of that, the value of assets in the ground are always lower, and therefore, whether or not, even if the asset is consumed, the value of that asset is reduced by the emissions mitigation scenarios, and this is a general finding in the literature.
Thank you. Adrian, before you address these questions, I have one last question for you. I don't want to leave it out. And we are almost running out of time, but I would like to ask this question. There is specifically for you from Shell Kune, and it says it has been proposed to compensate losers and basically buy out the fossil fuel industry with quote-unquote new money, which is currently created in quantitative easing programs around the world, but without a specific mission. How would you evaluate the potential of this strategy for Latin America? Go ahead, Adrian, please.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that that question was for me. I just wanted to emphasize the link between the three previous questions, which was the photovoltaic solar revolution, the possibility that CCS is not an option, and the possibility that retrofitting fossil fuels is an option. And what I want to say about this is that there's a case to be made in thinking about stranded assets as a risk for private investors that are investing in fossil fuels. If today you invest in coal power plants and your plan is that you're going to be able to use them because you are very hopeful that CCS is going to be available in the future, then it has to be clear that, first of all, you're taking an enormous risk on the fact that maybe the technology isn't there. And then as Gokul already said, even if the technology turns out to be there, it's not clear that it makes sense financially, because you would have to, the investments you have to do in terms of changing the place, for instance, of maybe you're building your coal power plant in a place where there's no suitable storage, so you would have to do enormous investments to be able to capture the CO2. And what I wanted to say also is that all this revolution, all this downside risk for the fossil fuel energy is not only dependent on the fact that your country implements stringent climate policies. It can come just from the boom in new renewable energy. So if people, just the consumers, start to demand renewable energy, or, which is almost already happening in a lot of places, if renewable energy becomes cheaper than fossil fuels, then renewable energy could become cheaper than fossil fuels in one country because the renewable energy industry has been supported with research and development efforts and piloting efforts in Europe. So your country doesn't need to be doing renewable energy policies for renewable energy technologies to become cheaper in your country. So all of that, I think, makes the case for being cautious in investing in more more fossil fuels at a high scale. Then, yeah, of course, it depends on the situation of each country and on a lot of factors. But yeah, my general point is that it's not only about climate policy. And then the question on could we buy off the fossil fuel industry using quantitative easing instruments? I think this is a very tricky question. It's going to be difficult for me to answer. One challenge is that these things don't necessarily happen at the same place and under the same jurisdictions. For instance, not all countries are having quantitative easing policies right now. I think we basically are finally getting out of the financial crisis, and these kind of policies are being phasing down anyway. And the fossil fuel energy isn't necessarily located in the same places. And then I don't know that it would be politically feasible anyway to buy off the whole fossil fuel industry. In my presentation, I emphasized that if people stand to lose, then that could create political economic problems. But that doesn't mean that the solution is to even though I took the example of the slave owners in the British Empire, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the solution. I don't know that voters in the United States, voters in Europe would support buying off the fossil fuel energy for equity reason within the climate policy.
Thank you, Adrian. I would really like to thank you and Jay and Gokul for sharing the results of this very interesting work and this great collaboration. We hope that, as it was mentioned, as the work advances, we can share more results with the Let's Lack membership. I would like to remind everyone who has been participating in the webinar that is being recorded, that is going to be available. And please, if you want to revisit the discussion or share it with your colleagues, please help us share this with a wider audience. So I hope Adrian and Jay and Gokul that as mentioned, we can organize another webinar around the second half of the year to continue sharing this work that you're doing. And also, please, if you have new publications, I would like to say that we have shared one publication from Adrian in the chat on distributive impact of energy subsidies and reforms. But if you have, Adrian, Jay, and Gokul, more documents to share, please send them to us, and we will share them with the Let's Lack membership. So thank you very much for this great collaboration, and we wish you all the success in the rest of the project. And thank you to everyone who has joined us this morning for us in Central and South America. Please join us in the next webinars that we are going to have. The next one on February 7th on landscape restoration and climate compatible development. So thank you very much, Adrian, Jay, Gokul. I would leave you just for a short final word for the participants.
Thank you, Ana Maria.
Hi, this is Adrian.
Yeah. Go ahead, Adrian.
Sorry, I was just going to say thank you, everybody. It was a real pleasure, and I hope we can do something similar again soon.
I share Adrian's enthusiasm for this as well.
And me as well.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to all the participants, and have a great day and rest of the week. Goodbye.
Thanks.